Good morning, everybody. All right. So I was last in Iowa canvassing for Barack Obama in primary season back in, would that have been 2008? And I met my now husband and the father of my two children on that trip, my last trip to Iowa. So this better be a productive trip. It's a high bar. I am delighted to be here, and I thank you, Barbara, for that introduction, for your leadership. We were just talking that her timing was impeccable as she took over just a month or two before the pandemic would strike, and her leadership has been invaluable in these incredibly challenging last several years. You have led through a pandemic that devastated farmers around the world. You have done tremendous good in transitioning the foundation into the Zoom era, linking experts as well as students to tackle the food security issues of our time. And I think yesterday you were telling me that having a Ukrainian farmer beaming in, really brought home the stakes of that war, but also of the food crisis that the conflict affects and exacerbates around the world. And again, that's one of the changes out of the pandemic that you have helped facilitate and that we can all take advantage of. And so just grateful to you for your leadership and for having me here today. I also want to acknowledge Ambassador Ken Quinn, who has spent his career fighting hunger around the world, from his early days as a rural development officer in Vietnam to his work with communities and refugees from Southeast Asia, to his 2 decades of leadership right here in Iowa. And I have to, of course, congratulate Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig, this year's World Food Prize laureate. Congratulations, Cynthia. And just a word on her, not that you need more, but back in the 1980s, as climate science had only just begun to take shape, and it's hard to remember these days, but when greenhouse gas was the furthest thing from a household term, Dr. Rosenzweig was among the first to recognize the links between food and climate change. Not just that climate change would restrict the world's ability to feed itself, but that the way we eat and grow has such lasting effects on the environment. Dr. Rosenzweig's research could not be more timely, needless to say, because today we award the World Food Prize amidst the greatest global food crisis of our lifetimes. And that really is what I would like to discuss with you today. In a world where climate change is leading to ever more disastrous shocks, with so many of the harshest impacts falling on poor farmers, how we break the cycle of lurching from food crisis to food crisis, how we can harness the industry and know-how and just stubborn determination of farmers around the world, as well as the work of the tremendous innovators in this room, those tuning in, and all around the world, to feed the planet, and to feed the planet without accelerating climate change even further. This is a tall order, but we know what is required. It starts with changing what we grow, how we grow it, and who benefits. And it could not be more urgent. Each night, as many as 828 million people go to bed hungry. 40 million people face emergency levels of hunger. That means that such households have already seen family members die due to a lack of food. And once again, in the country of Somalia, unless we see a much more significant inflow of humanitarian assistance, the UN predicts famine is imminent, and parts of Ethiopia soon could follow. Already there in the Horn of Africa, millions of livestock have died. And the pastoralists who have tended to those livestock over so many generations have lost their livelihoods and their source of meaning and identity. On my trip to the Horn of Africa this summer, I met with pastoralists, but also the wives of those pastoralists. And I heard reports of a growing number of suicides in these communities. So desperate had conditions become. And aid workers in that region, they've seen drought, they've seen deaths from severe acute malnutrition in the past. But this spate of suicides, they said, this is something new. This level of devastation is something none of those that I met with had ever seen before at scale. There are many culprits behind today's food crisis. You know them well. The COVID-19 pandemic, grinding economies to a halt, splintering supply chains, causing huge spikes in inflation everywhere, it seems. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, holding hostage global supplies of food, fertilizer, and fuel, denying food to the world's poorest communities. And that's one of the many conflicts, actually, that is contributing to hunger around the globe. But more than any other force, it is climate change that threatens humankind's ability to feed itself. According to a UN report from last year, the world now faces 3 times the number of extreme weather disasters each year than we did in the 1980s. Those disasters hurt agriculture more than any other industry, with the greatest harm caused to the poorest countries, those least responsible for climate change. Between 2008 and 2018, natural disasters alone cost developing countries more than $108 billion in crop damage, lost harvests, and those thinning herds. And this year, there is a ubiquitousness and a relentlessness to climate shocks that is causing searing pain across communities and fueling ever louder cries for climate justice. The unprecedented drought in the Horn of Africa was caused by 4 failed rainy seasons. There are fears that a 5th failed rainy season has just gotten underway. Somalia is no stranger to drought, so much so that the worst ones are named for the effects that they wreak. In 1980, it was called cattle killer. The last one, in 2017, Sima, which means equal. It was believed then to be the worst yet. It spared no class, no gender, no region. This year's drought has yet to be named, though one Somali man who fled his desiccated fields suggested white bone. In response to this climate disaster, we are committing unprecedented amounts of humanitarian aid. In 2020, after the onset of the pandemic, the United States spent $10.7 billion on humanitarian assistance. This year, we have already topped $15 billion. $865 million spent to address the crisis in Somalia alone. Now that aid, of course, is critical to meeting today's emergency food needs. It is life-saving. Again, I saw this firsthand. And we need other donor nations to step forward. And to just give one indication of how urgent it is for those countries to do that, right now, America's contributions to the World Food Program cover 89% of their emergency appeal for the Horn of Africa. 89%. I'm proud of that we are stepping up, but that is not the division of labor that we need on this earth if we are to be in a position to meet other emergency needs. In 2017, during the last drought in the Horn, the United States accounted for over 1/3 of total funding, as the rest of the world did more to chip in. But the truth is, climate change is wreaking havoc faster than we can respond, honestly. Faster Temperatures and floodwaters are now rising faster than emergency assistance budgets. There is just no way we can keep up simply through cash or food aid. The course we are on is unsustainable. If climate change were to lead to multiple simultaneous breadbasket failures in coming years, the potential is almost too dark to imagine. But we do have a path out of the darkness, a path that the creator of the World Food Prize himself helped illuminate. We should remember that Norman Borlaug also faced a bleak forecast when he first began his work. In the late 1960s, when the global population had exploded, increasing by 1 billion people in less than 4 decades, many predicted the onset of global famine, including famously the biologist Paul Ehrlich, who famously declared in 1968 that the battle to feed all of humanity is over. He was implying, of course, that it had already been lost. But Borlaug, with his Midwestern resolve, proved Ehrlich wrong, embracing agricultural innovation as a way to feed the world. After years of research, as you well know, Borlaug, along with other researchers and institutes working on similar efforts, created new strains of staple grains like wheat and rice that helped bring about significant food production increases across Asia and Latin America. His work and the agricultural innovations it inspired saved over 1 billion lives and pulled hundreds of millions out of hunger. And as countries moved out from under the immediate threat of famine and began to engage in global agricultural trade, food supplies increased, not just in individual countries, but worldwide. Beyond its immediate impact on hunger, the Green Revolution transformed agriculture as it had been understood and as it had been practiced. It decreased the need for farmland expansion, tripling grain production while cultivating limited amounts of additional land. By reducing food prices and boosting global economies in developing countries, it significantly lowered poverty rates. And it showed that an embrace of agricultural innovation, coupled with broad public and private agricultural investment, could dramatically reduce hunger. But the Green Revolution also led to trade-offs. Trade-offs that paled in comparison to the stomachs filled and the lives saved, but that many of you have spent years studying and trying to mitigate. As staple grains like wheat, rice, and corn became cheaper and more accessible, protein and iron-rich crops like lentils and chickpeas became much more expensive, with significant consequences for community nutrition and, it would turn out, significant consequences for resilience against the climate change to come. The methods used to grow crops themselves also had serious implications for the environment. Although new high-yielding crops initially lowered the need for farmland expansion, the fertilizers and pesticides that helped fuel large spikes in production, when not used judiciously, polluted water sources. And vast expansion and inefficient management of irrigation depleted aquifers and caused salt buildup in the soil, causing some of the world's most fertile soil in places like India and Pakistan to shrivel up. And the initial benefits of increased harvests were spread unevenly due to inequities that far predated Borlaug. Farmers with access to higher quality land, fertilizer, and irrigation could take advantage of new seeds and innovations. But poorer farmers who lacked access to food storage options and markets lagged behind, and women were sidelined by laws and cultural norms. Nowhere was this inequity clearer than in Africa. Already the region's soils were more challenging. Little of its arable land was then being irrigated, and many of its communities lacked the infrastructure of other regions to connect farmers to suppliers and markets. Private sector companies didn't think that they could profit by investing in rural areas or in smallholder farmers. And a lack of government support meant that there wasn't enough public funding to close the gap. Despite these trade-offs, the primary lesson of the Green Revolution was clear. With investments in agricultural productivity and fundamental research, food supply can grow faster than demand. Unfortunately, again, as you well know, over time, investments in agriculture plummeted, and humanitarian aid, it's no coincidence, soared. In 1996, emergency aid made up just over a third of all food assistance, with the rest going to agricultural investment. In 2006, those numbers flipped, with 66% of all food assistance going toward emergency aid. But we know that investing in sustainable agricultural growth isn't just a more sustainable way to fight hunger and poverty, it's cheaper too. In Afghanistan, for example, cultivation packages that help farmers grow wheat can provide a year's supply of staple grains for a family of 7 at just over $150. In contrast, cash transfers to purchase the same amount of food at a local market would cost more than $600, and direct food aid would cost more than $1,000. The costs of those years of underinvestment in agriculture became visible in around 2007. Global food prices spiked, pushing the number of people going hungry above 1 billion, or a sixth of the world's population. The importance of agricultural investments could not have been more clear. And, as we all recall, it propelled the United States to call on the world to increase agricultural investments at the 2009 G8 summit in L'Aquila. It is the spirit that animated the creation of our food security initiative at USAID and in the US government, Feed the Future. Today, the United States contributes more than $1 billion to Feed the Future each year, a commitment that President Biden reaffirmed last fall for an additional 5 years. To date, Feed the Future investments have unlocked more than $4.8 billion in agricultural financing, leveraged more than $2.6 billion in private sector investment in food security, and generated more than $17.9 billion in agricultural sales for smallholder farmers. And we have learned tremendous amounts by working with our partners in the field, so we are iterating. Today, as we stare down a global food crisis, and as we have to anticipate more climate-induced pressure on food production in the future, it is clear that we must learn the lessons of the past and tailor and scale our methods to the world that we now face. A world where climate change is wreaking havoc on crop production. A world where agriculture itself can be a leading source of environmental stress. A world where inequities continue to limit the potential to help those most in need. To take account of that world, this world, we need to accelerate and dramatically expand efforts to transform what we grow, how we grow it, and who benefits. Everything starts with what we grow, with our ability to produce more food more quickly. Back in the 1960s, scientists had to painstakingly observe the behavior of generations of crops to know which lines to cross, taking years to increase yields. But today, genome sequencing allows scientists to rapidly select the most desirable varieties to cross, in some cases shortening the breeding process from years to a matter of months. USAID is supporting this kind of accelerated breeding around the world. For example, to help bolster wheat production in Southern Asia, we're funding the Applied Wheat Genomics Innovation Lab, an initiative led by Kansas State University, with research sites in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. The lab has sequenced more than 74,000 wheat varieties to identify traits that boost climate resilience and yields. For nations that choose to embrace it, genetic engineering, inserting new sequences into plant genomes, can quicken the pace even further. In Bangladesh, 4 varieties of genetically engineered insect-resistant eggplants approved in 2013 have benefited more than 65,000 smallholder farmers by increasing yields and incomes, reducing pesticide use, and improving food safety. Inserting new sequences into plant genomes, creating genetically modified organisms, sometimes meets with resistance, despite extensive evidence of safety. But newer genomic techniques like CRISPR allow scientists to quickly and precisely introduce specific changes to a crop's genome that don't involve gene transfer. For example, scientists can now snip out a gene that makes a crop susceptible to disease, or tweak base pairs to help a crop withstand drought or rising temperatures. The problem, however, is that smallholder farmers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, don't often benefit from new technologies, since funding comes mostly from private sector companies looking to profit from crops that may not be bred for rural smallholder communities. Even if they are, the seeds often aren't tailored to local soils, salinity, and climate, which are all also rapidly changing as a result of the climate crisis. And farmers on the ground, understandably, don't want to take a risk on more expensive, unfamiliar seeds with their hard-earned cash, especially if they are living season to season. But homegrown innovation, new crops developed in the environments where they will be harvested, can address some of these barriers. In partnership with American universities, we are investing in crop breeding innovation in partner countries, innovation that tailors new seeds to their environments and builds trust with local farmers by showing them that taking risks on agricultural innovation pays off. We know how effective this can be. In the 1990s, USAID and the Rockefeller Foundation supported a talented young Ethiopian scientist who bred new varieties of sorghum resistant to drought and the parasitic weed, striga. The new seeds, distributed in 12 countries across sub-Saharan Africa, including in the Horn, quadrupled yields, even in areas facing severe drought. That scientist was Dr. Gebisa Ujeta, who won this very award in 2009 and who is here today in the audience somewhere. There we go. Today, we are supporting a new generation of African scientists building on Dr. Ujeta's work. I'm excited to announce that USAID will invest nearly $3.8 million to support the ISA Afri Center, Kenyatta University, and Addis Ababa University to use CRISPR to develop new Striga-smart varieties of sorghum. These new varieties will accelerate breeding efforts and protect farmers from devastating weed infestations that still plague many African farmers today, while minimizing the need for herbicides or the laborious hand weeding so often done by women. But it's not enough to simply find more suitable crops to grow. Currently, food systems contribute nearly a third of greenhouse gas emissions, a percentage that will almost certainly increase if we ramp up global agricultural productivity the way we've done in the past. Today, the ways we grow our crops must not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also help communities vulnerable to climate change build resilience. For the last decade, USAID has supported new practices and processes that allow local communities to produce more food in an increasingly volatile climate while reducing agriculture's environmental and climate footprint, what has come, of course, to be known as climate-smart agriculture. We are supporting these efforts in smallholder farming communities across sub-Saharan Africa. In Ghana, for example, where smallholder farmers often irrigate their crops using pumping systems powered by expensive fossil fuels, USAID invested in the research and development of small-scale solar-powered irrigation systems, systems that are not only sustainable, but are more affordable and return higher profits while also benefiting the women tasked with collecting irrigation water from sources miles away. The key today is to make these new climate-smart practices accessible, to train farmers to use technologies and techniques that will make farming more efficient and to scale them so that more farmers can benefit. We are funding efforts in both of these areas. In the Sahel region, where hundreds of thousands of farmers rely on trees to protect sorghum and other crops from harsher temperatures, our research partners are working with communities to plant perennial grasses, shrubs, and trees in croplands. These perennial plants improve soil health, help crops withstand extreme weather, and provide valuable livestock feed, all while sequestering carbon. We're also using digital innovation to help farmers reduce the amount of fertilizer that goes to waste, a major source of soil and water pollution, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. It's waste that stems from the fact that fertilizer application for so many is so often a guessing game. In Ethiopia, with USAID support, US universities and the International Fertilizer Development Center are working with local scientists and other donors to address that problem. Satellite imagery from space and remote sensing help researchers determine exactly how much fertilizer to apply and where and when to apply it. Using this information, scientists create fertilizer recommendations, which they use to train farmers to more efficiently use their supplies, their increasingly scarce supplies. The technology has helped reduce fertilizer waste by 80% on farms that benefit from this know-how, while more than doubling crop yields. The government of Ethiopia has been working to scale this approach, an approach we call space to place. They've been scaling it across the country, where it has already expanded to over a few million hectares in just a few years. And today, USAID is providing more than $27 million in additional funding to bring this approach to other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a region where fertilizer use is low, precisely because high costs and a lack of information about how to use it most effectively prevents farmers from reaping its benefits. Here's the challenge. Programs like Space to Place must be expanded much more rapidly than the United States and our partners are currently on pace to do. We need help from governments, the private sector, donors, and nonprofits to accelerate and scale their use, and to create more programs like it. We need far greater public investment in agricultural research and development, research that develops and improves techniques like fertilizer efficiency and crop diversity. We especially need those investments from governments in developing countries, which are currently lagging. That is despite the Malabo Declaration, which reaffirmed the African Union's 2003 goal of committing 10% of public spending on agriculture, a goal that just 4 African countries currently meet. Beyond climate change, one of the targets of increased public investment in food systems should be food fortification, which adds essential vitamins and minerals during food processing and remains one of the most impactful ways to tackle malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. While it can't replace a diverse, nutritious diet, food fortification can give families a kind of nutritional safety net, you might say, providing the essential nutrients that they need to survive. And it's incredibly cost-effective. Iron fortification costs 8 cents per child. Iodine fortification of salt, even less. The problem, however, is that food fortification is unaffordable for food processors. Producing food products from raw materials, like flour from wheat, is a business that already operates on razor-thin margins. And they have no way of mitigating those additional costs because low-income families can't afford to purchase more expensive fortified products. As a result, governments are hesitant to set and enforce nutritional standards for fear of putting small and medium-sized food processors out of business. That is why I am pleased today to announce a new $75 million investment in large-scale food fortification. The project, which we're calling Afford, will work with food processors, civil society, country governments, and private sector companies in Feed the Future countries and beyond to add micronutrients to staple foods. With this funding, we will work with governments to set and enforce nutritional standards, while also providing resources to expand and scale fortification across regions facing malnourishment. But alongside supporting agricultural innovations and developing and scaling more sustainable practices, the first two elements of what I'm here to talk to you about today, it is essential that we take on a third element in a more intense way, and that is making sure that the playing field be leveled for small farmers, especially women, who make up nearly half the agricultural workforce in low-income countries. When I visited Zambia a few months ago, I spoke with women farmers facing similar barriers as other smallholder farmers. Most immediately, the soaring cost of fertilizer, which led them, they said, to be able to buy half as much. And in most instances, that meant for them planting half as much. But they had additional challenges beyond those faced by their male counterparts, other smallholder farmers. There, as in so many low-income countries, women can't access the same financial resources as men can, limiting their ability to purchase land, seeds, and equipment. A lack of emphasis on education for girls has prevented women farmers from gaining digital fluency and learning to use digital agricultural technology, which could undermine the impact of programs like Space to Place, even as we try to scale them. And due to competing unpaid obligations like cooking, cleaning, and childcare, which all too often fall on their shoulders, women have less time to devote to their farms than men. This lack of access to seeds, tools, and fertilizers has led to significant gender gaps in how much women are able to produce. In response, USAID is investing in the food systems that farmers, but especially women farmers, rely on. Systems that weren't designed with women in mind. Food systems include expanding access to new seeds, digital innovations, and financial resources, as well as ways to store excess harvests and to prevent food loss. When I traveled to Malawi a few months ago, I learned about our efforts to scale the distribution of improved disease-resistant peanut seeds, an effort especially important for women who make up the vast majority of farmers who primarily grow peanuts. And we're working to expand these same women's access to credit and loans as well. Loans that 97% of these women have paid back in full. To help expand women's access to digital innovation, we're partnering with private tech companies in Colombia to bring internet access and digital training to rural women, an effort that will help women farmers adopt digital agricultural innovations. And in Nigeria and Ghana, we're investing in food storage technologies, like airtight bags for maize, which women in Ghana use to feed flocks of poultry, and that have helped some increase their flocks by up to 5,000% in just 5 years. But perhaps the most important barrier to the success of women farmers is land ownership. According to the World Bank, more than a third of countries still place legal limits on women's ability to own land and property. In other countries, women farmers still struggle against cultural norms that leave farms to sons rather than daughters and relegate women and girls to the home. As a result, globally, women make up less than 15% of farm owners, limiting their ability to make purchasing decisions, access credit and loans, and increase yields. In Tanzania, where national laws protect women's land rights, but village property rights are less secure, USAID is supporting efforts to rectify that. We are working with local governments and village leadership to clarify and to document land ownership, while also educating village leaders and residents as to their rights to own land, efforts that have doubled the rate of land ownership among women. And in Bangladesh, USAID teamed up with PepsiCo to help women potato farmers participate in a land leasing activity, which helped them learn how to negotiate land leasing terms, an effort that resulted in many of the women accessing farmland independently for the very first time. There is tremendous potential here. If we can close the gender gap in agriculture, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that we can lift up to 150 million people out of hunger. Changing what we grow, how we grow it, and who reaps the benefits, that's how we can not just increase global agricultural investments, but target them to the areas where they can have the most impact. But we can't do this work alone. We never have. The fight against hunger is and always will be a collective effort. And as always, USAID is working to bolster our partnerships, which have helped us understand the impacts, possibilities, and challenges and limits in our work. I mean partnerships focused on research and innovation. Today, I'm pleased to announce the Global Food Security Research Strategy, jointly led by USAID and the US Department of Agriculture, and other federal partners who engage on it. The strategy provides a roadmap for investments and research, one developed in partnership with development organizations, universities, federal research agencies, and researchers in the communities themselves around the globe. And it will focus investments and research on three key areas: genetic improvements of crops and livestock, climate-smart agriculture, and improved nutrition. I also mean partnership with the private sector. Last year at COP26, President Biden announced that the United States will commit $1 billion over 5 years to spur investments in climate-smart food systems. More than 40 countries have joined that initiative, AIM for Climate it's called, as well as more than 150 private sector, academic institutions, as well as NGOs. We anticipate that number will increase at COP27 next month. I want to thank our bipartisan allies in Congress who have already dedicated so much to strengthening food security, and I look forward to working with them so we can devote even more resources to fund sustainable, climate-smart, and resilient food systems. Of course, I also mean partnerships with all of you. Regardless of whether you have formally worked with USAID, all of you are our partners in the fight against global hunger. And we are always learning from your expertise and your experience. Today, I urge all of our partners to join us in pursuing this vision for a sustainable and resilient agricultural future, one designed not just to feed us today, but to protect our tomorrow. I urge government partners to invest in research and development within their own borders, to partner with private companies and nonprofits to bring new seeds to environments too often overlooked, and to develop regulations and policies that encourage the development of safe, cutting-edge agricultural innovation. I urge private companies and nonprofits to partner with governments to affordably scale climate-smart practices and food fortification efforts through initiatives like Aim for Climate, and for nonprofits, civil society organizations, and community advocates to work alongside us to help the most marginalized communities take advantage of them. And I urge everyone, governments, communities, nonprofits, private sector companies, and individuals to change cultural norms that relegate women to the home and begin dismantling those cultural and legal barriers that are holding back our women farmers, our women leaders. Because when we hold women back, all the data shows we hold everyone back. Together, we can usher in a new era of renewal. Norman Borlaug had no patience for what he called the constant pessimism and scaremongering of those who saw famine as inevitable. Pessimism, he said, has no place in action. He believed to the end that no matter how dire the situation, there is always something we can do, if only we act, and act together. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Administrator Power. What an amazing travel through not only the history, covering so many dimensions, but also giving us the optimism and hope that we are trying to ground this entire discussion in. Because while there is so much going on that is so terribly challenging and devastating, and you painted that picture, there is so much reason for hope, and that's part of our foundation and our discussion this entire week, is to understand those areas for hope and the action, and where that, and you've depicted tremendous areas of action that the U.S. is leading in, but also building on what's going on around the world. So we're going to take a few more minutes for, maybe you and I will have just one question, and then we're going to turn it to the audience for just a few minutes, maybe one or two questions, just so you have a chance to hear from our group. We have a global audience. This is the global food security community part of it, and I know that they just so welcome all of your remarks and the strength and passion that you're bringing to all the work that you're doing. So capturing for us the commitment in climate smart agriculture, things like fertilizer waste and efficiencies gained there, new announcements like a Ford program, and really leveling the playing field for farmers in order to fully uplift. We've been talking the entire time about sustainable practices, but the need to really accelerate and scale. And that's exactly what you covered. So with everything that you have described about what's going wrong, but what we're trying to get right, just talk to us a little bit more about other opportunities. What worries you most about what you see now in the global food system, and how important really is this acceleration, and how do we do it?
Okay, great. So thank you, and nice to meet you all. Sorry I can't see you. I could make it more pleasant to meet you if I could see you properly. But
lights are coming up.
There we go. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I guess I'd say a few things, and I have my son. I'm going to digress for a second, but he has the hardest history teacher you could imagine. It's like he's 13, and it's, you know, graduate school history tests. But the teacher who traumatizes these kids because the tests are so hard, he refers to the tests not as tests, but as opportunities. So this is the approach I'm going to take. We have a lot of opportunities, right? Yes. in this messy world. So what worries me most, I think, you know, in the day-to-day, I worry a lot about Putin. But in the short, medium, long term, you can't help but worry most about the intensification of the climate change effects. And I was in Pakistan, you know, a month or 5 weeks ago, and a third of the country's underwater. Maybe 2 months ago, a third of the country underwater, just underwater. You're in a helicopter and you look down and you're like, oh, I'm over the ocean. No, actually the ocean is 300 kilometers away. You're over farmland, what was farmland. And every one of those farmers probably took out some debt in order to be able to plant, in order to be able to buy those inputs. And now what? It's gone, right? If be lucky that the debt toll wasn't even more substantial, but the long-term effects. So that's the worry. And again, what's exciting about being at USAID and being surrounded by people like you who are just constantly generating new ideas and approaches and seeing them work and being able to bring the data home and then go forth with real empirical evidence of what works, is that there is a path to mitigate the worst effects, and above all not above all, equally to have this sector contribute to the broader global effort to cut emissions. And so we just have to pursue the mitigation effort with such accelerated zeal and change the timelines that we're on. At the same time, the adaptation is now, and so that's our opportunity. I think that what worries me is so far we haven't seen the kind of interest in adaptation financing, whether climate smart agriculture or the vast array of other infrastructure adaptation, insurance adaptation. I mean, there's so many ways we need to do adaptation to support these communities. And right now, I think 2% of adaptation financing is coming from the private sector. Contrast that with renewables and the fact that so many companies now believe there is significant money to be made, and that that's where things are going, and that is now even outpacing government regulations and so forth. And so you could imagine how much more we would have on hand to scale in the climate smart agriculture realm if you saw that similar embrace. And people are coming to the table from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, but it's often more reliable to rely on the profit motive over time. And so I think that places an extra burden on us to make the case. I mean, by us, I mean the royal us, but to be able to show why this is a sound business investment as well. Because I think right now they're being kept at this sector is more at remove than we can afford, again, from companies where I think there is significant money to be made, and where there is a massive civic responsibility as well, given the role that large emitters have played. The other thing I would just say is I think both central to this conversation, but also more broadly in development, the agency of communities, the agency of women farmers, the agency of local actors is paramount. I think we all now say that regularly, and that's good, but at USAID, we are trying to migrate more of our resources to that actual approach. So there's there's a gap between what we aspire to see and what we are actually funding on the ground. So we've set targets, as you may have seen, around localization, both in terms of who we fund, but also in terms of co-design, co-evaluation, really just being true partners, not just partners in rhetoric and partners on paper even, but it just won't work otherwise, and it's not sustainable otherwise, right? Because then the large assistance partner comes in, they run a program, and then they're gone. And this is where, again, the partnerships with government, the greater investments that they make in agriculture, their willingness to invest in extension services or to encourage catalytic private sector actors to do so, all of that, just so important. And then just because research is such a big part of this, very much related to what I've just described, the need to invest in universities along the lines of the partnership that I described today and the additional resources there. But that $3.8 million is important, but you could imagine what investing, for example, in African research institutions, the payoff of that over time in the communities, in the faculty, in the students who go back to their communities. And so, in Feed the Future, we do that more and more, but for other donors, other funders, to really be looking to make those indigenous investments in the human capital that will have, as Bobby Kennedy said, ripple effects, create ripples of hope and ripples of knowledge over time. And then the very last thing I'd say is just, I am worried that assistance budgets, even this I can't even call an opportunity, even in the most generous sense, but what I said in my remarks about emergency budgets eating a larger and larger share, that would be one thing if overall development and humanitarian budgets were growing. And again, thanks heartily to the U.S. Congress for these substantial Ukraine supplementals, which provided an additional $760 million in food security assistance, well and apart from the additional more than $5 billion they provided in humanitarian assistance, not just for Ukraine, but again, written to allow us to address some of the dire spillover effects, from Ukraine and the drop that had occurred in our base funding for humanitarian assistance. But if the pie is static or just growing, incrementally, and some countries are counting surplus vaccine donations as part of their development assistance. I mean, you can do that for number crunching, but that's not going to help us scale this. And then you'll end up in this, which we risk doing, ending up in this doom loop where, again, it's emergency crisis after emergency crisis. The resources get sucked into that, but everybody providing those resources knows that it's the underlying, that you're putting a Band-Aid on, in a sense, a metastasizing ailment or disease. And so unless we get the assistance to keep people alive in the here and now, by assistance, I mean, there's government assistance, public sector assistance, but unless we get the investments across the board to walk and chew gum at the same time to do that, because we want to save lives, we're privileged to have that opportunity to do that. We're grateful to anybody who contributes to that effort. But again, it is the underlying issues that you all work on and building that resilience so that the effects of the next, failed rainy season are far less dire. Or so those pastoralists who've lost 500 livestock in the last 9 months, that their kids at least go to school and are in a position, maybe pastoralism in that area, is not going to be as viable as it might have been. I mean, I'd love to think there was a solution there, but there are major shifts in where communities are going to live, in how they're going to live. And there's a lot we can do through adaptation and building resilience, but the implications of these shocks to the food systems and to livelihoods go well beyond what we can do within a food lane or within an environmental lane. There are health implications, there are education implications, there's economic growth programming. So this just requires ambition and comprehensiveness that is also not the strong suit of the international community. We tend to work, and luckily food security and environment and climate are coming together, I think, in an absolutely overdue way. But there are many other dimensions to this challenge that need to be folded in as well. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's wonderful. And, honestly, what you've done today is to paint that comprehensive picture of really where action is needed in so many areas. And so many tremendous calls to action. And that's what we're seeking in our debate and dialogue this week. What are the substantial areas for action? And one of them, well, of course, on everybody's mind is Putin, of course, but really focus on climate change and agriculture and how they affect each other, and especially trying to address the adaptation needs and the mitigation needs and the huge investments going into mitigation and the huge need in adaptation. And you're depicting it beautifully and giving so many examples of where it can advance. And the call to greater investment bilaterally among donors of all types in the private sector, we all know this is what we have to see. In order to have this acceleration, everyone has to look at multiplying their investments and then to try to do it in a smart way. One of the things that people are committed to, I think, in this group, and we hear now in the climate change arena and in agriculture, is bringing together the silos of mitigation and adaptation. They have been siloed. And our laureate for 2022, Dr. Rosenzweig, is committed to bringing that together through a lot of our modeling projects and the multi-stakeholder projects that she runs, but it's got to be so pervasive, and we'll see it in COP27 in the way that they, really looking at the impacts that and the investments that are going to have co-benefits. Hopefully we'll be exploring a lot of that territory, but you've covered so much, and I think everyone here appreciates being grounded in the reality and the real challenges that we have, but also that optimism and the opportunities. So I think we should turn it to the audience for a moment. We're going to continue to take a little more time and make adjustments through the day. But
Sorry.
So it's just an opportunity. So we can't possibly resist. Elsa, I'm going to go right to Elsa Morano right here, and we can take one other.
Yeah, I think if it's okay, we'll ask both questions and you can answer them at
That'd be great.
once.
And
okay.
Actually, I don't know, if you wanted just to get their voices in the mix, we could hear from the few people who have their hands up, and then I could answer a couple and try to be a little more succinct than I've been.
Well, thank you, Administrator Power.
Please introduce yourself, and Julie as well.
My name is Elsa Morano, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Norm Borlaug Institute for International Agriculture at Texas A&M University, where we lead the innovation lab for small-scale irrigation that you mentioned in your remarks in terms of describing the work that we're doing with the women, farmers, and water accessibility. And
I'm Julie Borlaug,
Great.
Norm Borlaug's granddaughter, and I'll let Elsa ask her question, and then I just want to compliment you on many things, but one thing in particular.
Well, we can't leave that out.
well, my question is, because of exactly what you were talking about, the fact that budgets don't increase, but yet the proportion of your budget going to emergency relief has increased, so it takes away from others. There's other agencies in the government. I used to work at USDA, and USDA, of course, has their partnerships for climate change. And so we think that maybe if the same kinds of projects that are now being undertaken as part of that partnerships for climate change, or climate smart agriculture, I should say. For example, we at Texas A&M got one of those grants, Virginia Tech had gotten another grant, and so forth. But it occurred to me immediately, even though we're working in Texas, they're working in Virginia, those same principles that we're using in those projects could be used in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and so forth. So can you speak a little bit about the collaboration that maybe does exist already or that will be existing among the various agencies, USAID, USDA, regarding climate smart agriculture and adaptation, please?
Just a short.
Oh, I'm gonna be quick. And Elsa was my boss, and kind of still is. But so many of us in the Borlaug legacy world, which is pretty much all of us, have a hard time explaining a lot of the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution. And you so eloquently did that, and then pivoted to the future and what really matters. So could we all have a copy of your remarks? And we will quote you, paraphrase you, because it was wonderful, and that's what we need so we can move people, to the future.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That may be the only thing that is asked of me today that I can deliver. But no, thank you. Thank you so much. And let me just say, the team, again, that helped us think through how to do this. I mean, the knowledge and the learning. I'm relatively new to USAID. It just comes from years of research, and then trying to find a way to both talk to this audience, but also know that many audiences are not where you are, and as a newcomer again to USAID, wading into some of these debates and some of the contentiousness that sometimes sneaks up on me, trying to find these bridging formulations to say, look, there's this incredible good, and then here are the things that this is iteration, right? This is life. And so what can we learn? What were the trade-offs? And how, as we think about deepening the endeavor that we're all a part of today, how can we, take from that what we need and find the remedies? So I really appreciate you saying that, and I'll pass it along, most importantly, to the people responsible for the thinking behind it. Did you want to get another
We'll
couple
get one
voices
more
in?
question,
Okay,
yes,
great,
yes.
and then I'll answer Elsa's.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. Lawrence Haddad is here from GAIN.
Barbara, so we have a question from our wonderful Global Guides youth educators.
Yes, we can do that, but I'm going to have Lawrence come next, and we'll come to you, Daniel. And then that's really all we're going to have time for. I'm sorry. I'm sorry?
Happy to give them.
No,
Just
please.
go ahead. Go.
Okay.
We'll just
Please.
do both.
Global
So,
Alliance for Improved Nutrition.
So thank you so much for a great speech. Thank you for everything you do. You talked a bit about finance and catalytic finance. And I know you've been very supportive of the work we've been doing with INCOFIN under the Nutritious Food Financing Facility. But I think USAID and yourself, you're kind of ahead of the field in this regard. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit about why you are a trailblazer in this area and what we need to do to bring other development agencies along to be maybe a bit more, take a few more calculated risks. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. Daniel?
Administrator Powers, thank you so much for being here. My name's Daniel Foster. I'm an agriculture teacher educator at Penn State University, and I'm proudly representing approximately 55 educators learning about practice to improve on advancing global food security education and being those catalysts of change for that human capital you discussed. And my question is, what can we do? They're sitting here thinking about what their role is and how they can contribute in their local communities. And my question to you is, how, and we think about the need for workforce development and this generational challenge, how can we build ways of investment to amplify developing the capacity of these agricultural educators around the world as a community of practice? What ways can we identify partnerships and collaborations of picking up teachers all over the world to share how they engage in these complicated issues of motivating that next generation of hunger warriors? So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, let me just try briefly to just touch on each, and thank you all. So you will have, I think, Secretary Vilsack coming here later today?
Thursday.
Oh, Thursday, okay. He was on my plane last night.
He's here.
He's definitely here. And we were actually gonna do something jointly today, but our schedules, didn't quite align. But, we work incredibly closely with USDA, and I've been privileged. He and I are repeat, senior officials. He was, of course, in the same role under Obama when I was at the UN. So we have the sort of personal relationship that is very collaborative, but it's really the integration of our teams, and I think very much stemming, and I'm sure, Elsa, that you can educate me a little bit about where there are shortcomings here, but stemming from the premise of your question, stemming from this belief that research, wherever it happens, if it has practical application, in other communities, in other soil, with other climates, that we need to take advantage of that. And again, where the synaptic sort of breakdown is, where or how we accelerate the transfer of knowledge from the kinds of investments that are being made here, through the kind of partnership you mentioned, but any other happening, with, in a U.S. agricultural research investment, how we either, fill in those synapses where they're not happening, or accelerate the movement of knowledge, again, where applicable. I think that there's always more work to be done there, but it isn't for lack of collaboration. I think, many of the land grant universities, for example, that I have visited with, including historical Black colleges and universities where we're making a big push, to deepen our collaboration, particularly in agriculture. You know, you'll meet the crop also of USDA-funded young people who are going off, and as they get trained, they're getting trained, yes, to work in the agricultural sector, perhaps here, but many of them are already, you know, branching out and going overseas or want to join USAID. So it's at the
and honestly, many of them
yeah.
are here.
Yeah.
We have an entire crew of Borlaug Fellows here and others. So I think the audience really understands.
Yeah.
What you're
Well,
speaking
you'd know
to.
better than me then, but how it works in practice. I think our Mike Mishner, some of you know, comes from USDA over to USAID, and I think that kind of you know, cross-pollination is happening a lot. But again, I you know, we can't pretend that the world as it is, you know, that we're meeting the needs, or that knowledge is reaching people at scale in the way that we need. I mean, that's what I'm getting at again here today. And so any ideas about how that surge in investment that is being made through the partnership and through other you know, funding opportunities, because there's just a lot more money, you know, again, invested inevitably and in the United States. So again, you know, making sure that we are optimizing, I guess the best way to put it, in terms of our reach. And I think that these joint collaborations where you bring in you know, African universities or universities from the global South at an earlier stage, you know, then it's not about transfer knowledge and you know, needing to hire some consultant from here or there. It's actually a joint enterprise. In terms of other donors, I mean, there's so much I'm asking of other donors. Taking calculated risks, I will now add to the list. But you know, it's been difficult to see some long-standing donors really pull back. Granted, you know, the financial climate right now is as inhospitable as one could imagine. At the same time, that's why these investments are especially needed right now. So it's of course the wrong time to ask, and yet the only time to ask. But I take your point on nutrition, specifically on food fortification. I was very gratified. This isn't really as responsive to your question, but at the General Assembly, we came together. I had issued a commitment to in the emergency settings to fund the provision of RUTF through UNICEF. I made a $200 million pledge, which is the largest of its kind, and of course, sadly, acutely needed right now in this kind of miracle paste that can resurrect severe acutely malnutrition kids. And I issued a challenge to other donors to match and exceed that, philanthropy, private donors, and governments. And the challenge was for $250 million. And again, once you have that pipeline, once you know that RUTF is that you're going to have that amount of money and that number of orders, some of the pipeline issues can be addressed. After I left the stage and had issued the challenge, I was like, wait, we've got like a month. Like, what was I thinking? You know, there's no way. And we ended up, countries really did step up and meet that challenge. It's a kind of, I suppose for donors, a more gratifying investment, in the sense that you can just measure the number of lives you have saved, you know, with this miracle paste, with RUTF. But it was an example of them also doing things that they hadn't done before, and will allow investments in indigenous production capacity as well in Africa and so forth. So, so I think, you know, thinking through in the longer term resilience space, or the longer term nutrition space, you know, how to frame the risk taking and the challenge in a fashion that kind of puts oneself in the shoes of a politician who's thinking, you know, how do I describe this in a manner that lands, that's maybe, you know, part of what it's not just, hey, take a risk. It's, hey, and here's, you know, not, you know, why this can be beneficial, or why this, how you can communicate this in a manner that will resonate. Let me put it that way. And then lastly, on the on the educational front, you know, I mean, again, I think you would know best. I do think marrying the gloom and doom of various forecasts with the energy, and it's not blind optimism, right? It's an energy that in every generation, in every field, comes with science and discovery. And I think for young people, and I see this again in my own kids, it's just, you know, polar bears on, you know, melting glaciers and Pakistan underwater, and, you know, in my family's case, mommy going off to Pakistan that's underwater. I mean, the amount that young people are taking in that can render them almost paralyzed by how overwhelming these needs are, and how daunting the forecasts are. Marrying that with knowledge of what breakthroughs have achieved in the past, and what is in the works, and what has been piloted but not yet been scaled. And I think just as a teacher myself, that getting that combination right, I don't think we are necessarily right now. I mean, I'm not speaking for you, but I will say, in you know, I taught at the Kennedy School before coming back to government, and you know, it is. I mean, there's plenty of coverage of innovation. There's plenty of knowledge about development breakthroughs and so forth. But when you see the SDG gains just being walloped, and having seen the, you know, the inroads made in, you know, even on malaria, TB, HIV, you know, and then because of COVID, you know, those interventions, you know, falling behind, routine immunization falling behind, and then the climate, the kind of mother of all threats that touches every development sector, it can be challenging, right? And we want to recruit people into this line of work to feel inspired with the knowledge that they can make a difference. That, as I like to say, you know, they may not change the world, right? But they will be able to change many, many individual worlds. And I think finding that way to talk about what we do, to summon people with the urgency and with the need, and with the realities, the fairly grim realities, but always, again, going out of our way to try to paint a picture of that pathway. So.
Thank you so much. Great set of questions, and of course, education and educating our young people. Part of the mission of the World Food Prize is absolutely the next generation of norms, and grounding them in knowledge. We start in high school doing that, right, and through our programs. And so appreciate all of your comments so much. Thank you for spending extra time with us, and thank you again for coming to Des Moines. I hope that,
to be here.
that we have a high standard given
2 for 2.
2 for 2.
Thank
Let's
you.
give her a, yeah.
Thank you.